Dear students, welcome to this audio lecture. In this lecture, I shall be discussing the English poem titled Night of the Scorpion, written by the Indian poet Nissim Ezekiel. So before I read out the text of the poem and discuss the subject matter and the language that has been used in the poem Night of the Scorpion, let me first of all brief a little bit about Nissim Ezekiel as a poet. Nissim Ezekiel is considered to be the first Indian poet who expressed modern Indian sensibility in modern idiom. Born in 1924 in Bombay, he published Night of the Scorpion in his book titled The Exact Name in 1965. Writing in English language, Ezekiel drastically influenced the literary scene in India during his long career spanning over 40 years. Nissim Ezekiel received Sahitya Akademi Cultural Award in 1983 and also received the prestigious Padma Shri in 1988 for his contribution to the Indian writings in English. After a prolonged illness, Nissim Ezekiel passed away in 2004 in Mumbai. Ezekiel made a great contribution to the field of Indian English poetry. Ezekiel's poems primarily examine themes associated with daily life, often wrestling with the ideas of belongingness and Indianness, and hence his poems are regarded to be quintessentially Indian. Dear students, in this audio lecture, I shall be discussing one of Nissim Ezekiel's famous poems titled Night of the Scorpion, written in 1953. Now let me read out the text of the poem Night of the Scorpion. I remember the night my mother was stung by a scorpion. 10 hours of steady rain had driven him to crawl beneath a sack of rice. Parting with his poison, flash of diabolic tail in the dark room, he risked the rain again. The peasants came like swarms of flies and buzzed the name of God 100 times to paralyze the evil one. With candles and with lanterns, throwing giant scorpion shadows on the mud-baked walls, they searched for him. He was not found. They clicked their tongues with every movement that the scorpion made. His poison moved in mother's blood, they said. May he sit still, they said. May the sins of your previous birth be burned away tonight, they said. May your suffering decrease the misfortunes of your next birth, they said. May the sum of all evil balanced in this unreal world against the sum of good become diminished by your pain. May the poison purify your flesh of desire and your spirit of ambition, they said. And they sat around on the floor with my mother in the center, the peace of understanding on each face. More candles, more lanterns, more neighbors, more insects, and the endless rain. My mother twisted through and through, groaning on a mat. My father, skeptic, rationalist, trying every curse and blessing, powder, mixture, herb, and hybrid. He even poured a little paraffin upon the bitten toe and put a match to it. I watched the flame feeding on my mother. I watched the holy man perform his rites to tame the poison with an incantation. After 20 hours, it lost its sting. My mother only said, "Thank God, the scorpion picked on me and spared my children." So students, the poem Night of the Scorpion by Nissim Ezekiel is a narrative poem that narrates the story of an anonymous mother and her unfortunate encounter with a scorpion. This poem focuses on a single episode in the life of an Indian family in which the mother of the narrator is stung by a scorpion one night. She suffers for 20 long hours while peasants, holy men, and her husband attempt several ways and methods in order to heal her pain. In this poem, Ezekiel describes how continuous rainfall for 10 hours had driven the scorpion into the house where it crawled beneath a sack of rice, and when his mother entered the dark room, the scorpion parted the poison into her toe and disappeared in the night. This news spread throughout the village, and the peasants gathered in the poet's house in large numbers like the swarms of flies, and buzzed God's name about 100 times, praying to stop the movements of the scorpion. They believed that with every movement of the scorpion, the poison would also move into the mother's blood. So the villagers searched their house with candles and lanterns to paralyze the evil scorpion. But the scorpion disappeared in the night. The villagers prayed that the sins of mother's previous birth gets washed away that night, and that her sufferings might decrease the misfortunes of her next birth. They even prayed to God that the poison purifies her flesh. They sat around the mother who was groaning in pain. The poet described the peasants as superstitious and illiterate people, yet they had the willingness and the impulsive desire or eagerness to help the mother and share her pain. The poem wonderfully depicts the Indian ethos, superstitions, and cultural richness through this very simple incident in an Indian family. The father, meanwhile, has been portrayed as a skeptic, as well as a rationalist person who tried powder, mixtures, and herbs to cure the mother. He even poured some paraffin upon the bitten toe and burnt it. The priest, who also came to the spot, was also performing his religious rites to tame the poison. Finally, after 20 long hours, the pain of the mother subsided. For such long hours, the mother was groaning in pain and was not capable of uttering a single word. But after getting cured, she thanked God that the scorpion had chosen her and spared her children. This noble statement reflects the selfless love of the mother. This incident narrated in the poem symbolizes the typical Indian motherhood, which depicts a mother's sacrifice, a mother's unconditional love and affection for her children. Now, students, let me discuss the language that has been used by the poet Nissim Ezekiel in the poem. First of all, let us look at the structure. As far as the structure of the poem is concerned, it's a free verse containing 8 stanzas. The lines are of varying lengths and has no rhyme scheme in it and has a mixed meter. The narrator's childhood experience is described or conveyed through several images that stimulate the different senses. For instance, the expressions like scorpion crawling beneath a sack of rice, and also the expression like the peasants came like swarms of flies. They are powerful visual imagery in this poem. So as far as the visual imagery is concerned, we may mention these expressions that I have just now stated. Scorpion crawling beneath a sack of rice. Also, peasants came like swarms of flies. So these are powerful visual images. Now, there are also examples of sound imagery in this poem. For example, the peasants buzzed the name of God 100 times. So the word buzzed. And also another expression like they clicked their tongues. The word clicked. Here buzzed and clicked. These are examples of onomatopoeia. It's a figure of speech. It's a rhetorical device. It's a figure of speech in which words evoke the actual sound of the thing, that they refer to or describe. For instance, the tick-tock of a clock, or maybe the ding-dong of a doorbell. They are all examples of onomatopoeia. It's a figure of speech. As far as use of smell imagery in the poem is concerned, we may mention the use of expressions like smell of candles, and then again smell of burning oil in the lanterns. These are all examples of smell imagery. So we have mentioned the use of visual images, sound images, also smell imagery in the poem. Next, let us come to personification. Now, what is personification? Personification is a figure of speech in which an inanimate object is spoken as though it were endowed with life or human attributes. For instance, the expression in the second paragraph, it has been used, diabolic tale. Here, tale has been described as diabolic, suggestive of the devil. So, this is personification. In the third paragraph, there is use of simile. What is simile? Simile is another rhetorical device. It's a figure of speech. It's a comparison between two distinctly different things which are, indicated by words such as like or as. Here, the peasants came like swarms of flies. In the third paragraph, it's mentioned as the peasants came like swarms of flies. So here the word like is used. So it's a simile. The comparison between peasants and swarms of flies. Alright? So it's a simile. Now, there is also use of metaphor in the third paragraph. Metaphor is a figure of speech in which a word or a phrase is applied to an object or an action to which it is not literally applicable. Metaphors are used in poetry and literature to add some color to the language. It equates two things not because they actually are the same, but for the sake of comparison or symbolism. So it's also a comparison, just like simile. But then the thing is that in simile there are explicit words like like, like, and also words like as. Okay, these words are there. So they make the comparison very explicit. But in metaphor, that is not there. For instance, in the third paragraph, it is mentioned as to paralyze the evil one. In capital letters, it is written as evil one. To paralyze the evil one. Here, this evil one, the evil one refers here to the scorpion. So here it's a comparison. So it's a metaphor. Not a simile, but a metaphor. Now let us look at alliteration. What is alliteration? This is another poetic device. It's a sound device, the repetition of the same letter, same sound at the beginning of adjacent or maybe closely connected words in poems. So one of the main reasons for using alliteration in poetry is because it sounds pleasing, and it is also because it tries to give some attention to the readers or the listeners. Now throughout the poem, there has been several instances of alliteration. For instance, expressions like stung by a scorpion. Here, sir, the sound sir is repeated. Stung by a scorpion, sir. Repetition of the sir sound in stung and scorpion. Similarly, parting with his poison, per. Repetition of per sound, parting with his poison. Diabolic tale in the dark, diabolic, dark. Repetition of the der sound. Risked the rain, r sound has been repeated. Again, another expression like poison purify, per, it's repeated. Through and through, the th sound is repeated. Poured a little paraffin, per, it's repeated. Similarly, flame, feeding, herb, and hybrid. So there are several instances of alliteration, that is repetition of the same sound or the same letter at the beginning of adjacent words. Throughout the poem, this sound device has been exploited by the poet Nissim Ezekiel. Also, you can see that there are a lot of antonyms, opposite words. Antonyms means opposite words used in the poem, throughout the poem. For instance, opposite words like previous, next, evil, good, curse, blessing. Also skeptic, rationalist. These antonyms are also used in the poem. Now, what is hyperbole? Hyperbole is also another figure of speech. It's a rhetorical device which indicates an exaggerated kind of a statement not meant to be taken literally. For instance, in the third stanza, there is an expression, the peasants, they buzzed the name of God 100 times. So 100 times, that is a hyperbolic statement, an exaggeration. So this is also a figure of speech. Next is irony. Now, what is irony? The use of language that normally signifies the opposite, typically, for humorous or maybe for emphatic effect. Irony, for instance, in the 7th paragraph, there is a mention that the father is both a skeptic as well as a rationalist, trying every curse and blessing. So in the 7th paragraph, this sentence is very ironical. The father being both skeptic as well as a rationalist. Now, towards the end, I would like to also mention anaphora. Anaphora is a rhetorical device that features repetition of a word or maybe repetition of a phrase or a clause at the beginning of, successive phrases or clauses, in a poem. In the 7th paragraph, again, there is mention of, in the expression, for instance, more candles, more lanterns, more neighbors, more insects, and the endless rain. So there's a repetition of the word more, M-O-R-E, more candles, more lanterns, more neighbors, more insects. So this repetition of this particular word, in these successive phrases, this figure of speech is known as anaphora. So dear students, do keep in mind that the several rhetorical devices that have been used by Nissim Ezekiel in this poem, they are like the different images, the visual images, the sound or the smell images, and also personification, comparisons like simile, metaphor, also sound devices like alliteration, and then we have use of antonyms, hyperbole or exaggerated statement, irony, use of irony in the poem, and also anaphora, which is a rhetorical device that features repetition of a word at the beginning of successive phrases or clauses. So dear students, I hope this audio lecture will help you to some extent in understanding the theme, the subject matter, as well as in understanding the kind of language that has been used by Nissim Ezekiel in the English poem Night of the Scorpion. I shall come up with more such audio lectures. Thanks for listening.